Good morning. I'm Kate Lancaster here at the OECD in the midst of our OECD Forum and OECD Week, and it's my great pleasure to talk today to Professor Virginia Eubanks from the University of Albany in SUNY in the United States, and we're talking about her book, Automating Inequality. If you have not read it, I recommend you run, don't walk, to get a copy. It's an absolutely gripping read. I would say that it's a wonderful read, except that it's on a very challenging topic, and it gives you a lot to think about. It's about how and why our societies regulate poverty, and I don't say regulate accidentally, because I think what you're talking about is not how to fix poverty, not how to help with poverty, but how to control it. And so what struck me when I started your book is that you begin with the story of poorhouses in the 1800s, and I'm just wondering, why did you choose to start this story there?
Yeah, so bonjour, hello, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to talk about the book. This is the point at which I usually thank my editor, who originally there was a 90-page history chapter at the beginning of the book, and now it's a svelte 27 pages or so. But the history of poverty regulation in the United States is very, very important to understand, so that you can understand sort of what I think of as the deep social programming of the new algorithmic decision-making systems and predictive models that we're seeing in social services. So I go all the way back to 1820 and to the formation of what are called the poorhouse, or the county poorhouse in the United States, which were brick and mortar institutions for incarcerating the poor. And the reason I go back to the poorhouse is because that's the moment where we as a nation in the United States decided that our public service programs should be more moral thermometer, should be more about deciding whether you deserve aid rather than universal floor under everyone. So the metaphor of the digital poorhouse is to ground these new tools in our history, and particularly in the history of poverty policy in the United States, because we often talk about our new tools as if they just have appeared from nowhere, from the sky.
The magic of technology.
Yeah, and in fact, they're often more evolution than revolution. And so that's why I go back into the history and help people understand the context that they arose in.
And it's really interesting to see in a U.S. context, because I think a lot of people think of the poorhouse and they think of something Dickensian, like Oliver Twist, and they don't realize that many countries had this as a social tool, and certainly the United States has just as long a history of it.
Yeah, so the United States, originally we were supposed to have one in every county in the United States. We ended up with perhaps 1,000 of them, but not quite one in every county, because they turned out to be very expensive, and they did not work quite the way that the designers intended.
Well, moving ahead to today, in your book you describe 3 different initiatives using new digital technologies to, in theory, aid the poor or aid the needy. You talk about health services in Indiana, child services in Pennsylvania, and housing in Los Angeles. Can you pick an example and just walk us through it a little bit? What were the intentions of the program, and did they achieve what they wanted to achieve? Which I know is an ambiguous question.
No, it's a great question, actually. So we're going to take what I think in many ways is the easiest case, because the story is perhaps most familiar, and then I'm going to say why that's a weird case to talk about. But so one of the stories I tell in the book is about an attempt in the state of Indiana to automate and privatize all of the state's eligibility processes for their welfare programs. So that's Medicaid, that's cash assistance or TANF, and that is Medicaid or health insurance for the poor.
Right.
And so in 2006, then Governor of Indiana, Mitch Daniels, signed what was eventually a $1.34 billion, with a B, billion-dollar contract with a consortium of high-tech companies, including IBM and ACS, which moved about 1,500 local caseworkers from their county offices to these privatized regional call centers. And what that looked like from the point of view of folks applying for services is every time they called with a question or a concern, they got a new person, and no one was accountable for their case from beginning to end. From the caseworker's point of view, that looked like, rather than being responsible for and responsive to a docket of cases or families, they were responsible for a list or a queue of tasks that dropped into their workflow management system.
So one day you could be helping person A with one thing, the next day person B with something else, and you'd never hear about person A again?
Yeah, one moment, 7 minutes, you'd be talking person A, 7
would
minutes
disappear
later,
off your radar
you'd be
forever
talking,
after
and
that.
you'd never,
Okay,
yes.
wow.
And also you didn't necessarily have any local context about their situation, right? So if you're going through an application and it looks like, okay, maybe you're not going to be eligible for food stamps, but there's this food pantry in your town. That's
Right.
the kind of work that you could no longer do.
Okay.
And the result of that was 1 million benefits denials in the first 3 years of the program, which was a 54% increase from the 3 years before the program.
54% increase in denials.
In denials,
Okay.
yeah. Most folks who were denied for this catch-all reason called failure to cooperate in establishing eligibility. And that just meant someone had made a mistake. Like either you had missed a signature on page 34 of a 50-page form, or the call center workers had misapplied policy and given you bad advice, or something went wrong at the document processing center. So,
So it was your fault.
Yeah, a page fell behind the desk or got scanned in upside down. But the problem was because you no longer had access to a caseworker who understood your case from beginning to end, all of the responsibility for finding that error and correcting it fell on the shoulders of those folks who were applying for benefits, who are some of the most vulnerable people in this state.
Of course, and I mean, even the phrase itself, failure to comply, sounds very punitive, very judgmental, as opposed to we're missing a document or we need your signature.
Yeah, it's the first time that I know of that this very rarely used rule of failure to cooperate was used in sort of mass denials. So there's always been a failure to cooperate, like, box you could check.
Okay.
But it tended to be if somebody actively refused to show up to appointments over and over again, or refused to give you any documentation.
Okay.
And in this case, the automation of the process made it so anything could kind of count as failure to cooperate. And it had terrible, terrible impacts on poor and working people in Indiana. So I dedicate the book to a young girl, a severely disabled young girl named Sophie Stipes, who was 6 at the time that the automation was taking place, and who received one of these letters addressed to her that she had failed to comply in failed to cooperate in establishing eligibility, and that she'd be denied her Medicaid. Right?
Addressed to her?
Yeah.
Wow.
This was after, she had just started to, she had just had a gastro tube implanted in her stomach, which meant that she was finally getting enough nutrition, and she was just starting to sit up and just starting to walk. And this letter came at just a devastating time for her family. So the human costs of this were really, really high. I will also say that though poor and working families bore the worst impacts of this change, the state as a whole really paid quite a high price as well. So there was,
in what sense?
In one of the optimistic parts of the story is that there was huge organizing against this plan, and it was successful. So 3 years into a 10-year contract, the governor actually canceled the contract with IBM.
Okay.
IBM then turned around and sued the state for breach of contract, and in the first leg of the legal case actually won. So not only were they allowed to keep the $500 million they had already collected on this contract, but they were also awarded an extra $50 million in penalties. Okay. Right? So this is something that cost not only the poor and working families of Indiana, but the state more broadly.
So all taxpayers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's in 9 years in, that case is still in the courts. They're still trying to decide who's at fault.
Yeah, is it the policy design, or is it the way that it was implemented?
Exactly. Yeah. So, and this is why I said this is an interesting case, right? So you frame the question in terms of intention, and I often say, I don't know what was in Governor Daniels' heart, but I will say that it would be really difficult if you were designing a system to divert people from public assistance on purpose. It would be hard to create a more effective system than Indiana did, even if it was accidental. So one of the great folks I talked to, a Medicaid attorney named Chris Hawley in Bloomington, said, right, at least in theory, philosophically, our court system says it's better for 10 guilty people to go free than one innocent person to remain in jail. And he said this system turned that on its head. This system said it's better for 10 eligible people to be